If your species cannot outrun a predator, Professor Vaylor said as the lecture hall lights dimmed, then your survival depends on remembering every lesson I teach today. The room answered with quiet agreement. Rows of students from more than 30 star systems settled into their seats, eyes fixed on the massive holographic display hanging over the center of the classroom. Every face carried the same expression: respect, curiosity, a little fear. Every face except one. Caleb Walker sat in the very last row with a faded gray hoodie pulled halfway over his dark blonde hair, one sneaker resting on the empty chair beside him. A paper coffee cup balanced loosely in his hand, already cold from sitting through 2 earlier lectures. He looked less like someone attending an elite interstellar academy and more like a tired college student trying to survive another Monday morning. Professor Vaylor noticed him immediately. The human always looked relaxed at the wrong moments. For those of you joining us from protected worlds, Vaylor continued, today's course is mandatory. Every civilized species eventually encounters apex predators. Some survive because they learn. Others disappear because they believe confidence is a substitute for preparation. The enormous screen came alive. Images rotated through the air. Razor-winged hunters diving through crimson skies. Massive quadrupeds with jaws wide enough to swallow transport drones. Shadow predators that vanished against black volcanic stone. Every creature carried a casualty index beside its image. Every number made several students shift uneasily in their seats. You cannot negotiate with instinct, Vaylor said calmly. Predators do not hate you. They simply recognize opportunity. Caleb took another sip from his coffee without looking up. The student beside him, a tall blue-skinned alien named Ryan Talvek, glanced over and smirked. You should probably pay attention, Ryan whispered. Your species barely has claws. Caleb shrugged. Guess I'll have to improvise. Ryan chuckled, assuming it was a joke. Around the room, quiet conversations spread while the next slide appeared. Princess Mara of the Illyrian crown sat near the front, elegant in a simple academy uniform instead of ceremonial robes. Unlike most royal students, she actually listened. She glanced toward the human in the back. She had read enough about Earth to know humans were physically ordinary by galactic standards. Fragile skin, no armor, no venom, no enhanced night vision. It seemed unfair that someone so obviously vulnerable had been admitted into an advanced survival program. Vaylor raised one hand, and silence returned instantly. Many young species misunderstand danger, he said. They assume courage means standing your ground. It does not. Wisdom begins with knowing when to leave. Another image appeared, showing a peaceful hiking trail on an unfamiliar forest moon. Seconds later, the simulation replayed with invisible predators emerging from the trees. Several students inhaled sharply. Most victims, Vaylor explained, never realized they were being watched. Caleb finally looked up at the display. Not because of the predator, because of the trail. It reminded him of camping trips with his grandfather in northern Montana when he was 10 years old. Early mornings, cold air, pine needles under hiking boots. His grandfather had always repeated the same sentence before they entered the woods. The forest is talking. Stop trying to be the loudest thing inside it. Caleb smiled to himself before looking back down at his coffee. Professor Vaylor noticed the smile. He mistook it for nervousness. Mr. Walker, he called across the lecture hall. I hope today's material proves especially useful for you. Every head turned toward the last row. Caleb met the professor's eyes without embarrassment. Maybe, he answered simply. A few students laughed politely. Vaylor smiled. Earth has remarkably few natural defenses compared to most council species. Fortunately, education exists to compensate for biology. More laughter followed. Even Mara offered a sympathetic smile toward the quiet human. Caleb gave a small nod as if accepting the observation without argument. He had spent most of his life letting people underestimate him. It usually made conversations shorter. Vaylor activated the final slide before the practical exercises. Across the screen appeared one sentence in enormous silver letters. How to escape a predator. The professor folded his hands behind his back. By the end of today's class, he said confidently, every one of you will know exactly what to do when a predator finds you. Caleb looked at the words for a long second, then slowly lifted one hand from the back row. Caleb kept his hand raised while the rest of the room looked back and forth between him and Professor Vaylor. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it was long enough to make several students wonder whether the human had a serious question or simply did not understand the lesson. Vaylor smiled with practiced patience. He had taught hundreds of species over 3 decades. Nervous students often interrupted before thinking. "Yes, Mr. Walker?" Caleb lowered his coffee cup onto the small, folding desk beside him. "You said every one of us would know what to do when a predator finds us." "That is correct. Does that depend on the species?" Vaylor nodded. "Naturally. Every predator hunts differently." Caleb leaned back in his chair. "That makes sense." Vaylor waited for the follow-up question, but none came. He cleared his throat and continued. "Our first principle is recognition. You cannot survive what you fail to identify." The holographic display shifted again. This time, dozens of predators rotated through the air together. Some relied on speed, others on camouflage. Some hunted alone, while others worked in coordinated packs. The classroom grew noticeably quieter as the data filled the room. Every image carried detailed notes about behavior, preferred environments, and recommended escape strategies. Princess Mara carefully typed notes into her tablet without looking away from the screen. Ryan folded his arms confidently, whispering to the student beside him. "I already passed the simulation last semester." "Barely," his friend whispered back. "Still passed." Vaylor pointed toward the largest creature floating above the center aisle. "Observe the shoulders. Broad muscle distribution. Forward-facing eyes. It commits only when success is nearly guaranteed. If you encounter this predator, running immediately is your only realistic option." Several students nodded. One raised a hand. "Professor, what if escape routes are blocked?" "Then create distance until an opportunity presents itself." Another student asked, "What if it corners you?" Vaylor answered without hesitation. "Avoid allowing that situation to occur." A few students laughed softly, easing the tension. Caleb remained quiet. His eyes never stayed on one predator for very long. Instead, he studied the terrain surrounding each one. Forest mountains, rivers, snowfields, open plains. Professor Vaylor noticed again. "You seem distracted, Mr. Walker." Caleb shook his head. "Not distracted." "Then perhaps you would like to explain your observations to the class." Dozens of eyes settled on him once more. Caleb hesitated for a moment before speaking. "The files spend a lot of time describing the animals." "As they should. Not much time describing where they live." Vaylor frowned slightly. "The environment is secondary." Caleb gave a polite smile. "Back home, it usually is not." Ryan rolled his eyes. "Everything comes back to Earth with humans." Caleb laughed quietly. "Usually because we have to live there." Even Mara smiled at that answer. It sounded less like arrogance and more like simple experience. Vaylor walked slowly toward the back of the lecture hall until he stood only a few feet from Caleb's desk. Earth is classified as a moderate developing member world. It contains dangerous wildlife, certainly, but compared to many council planets, its ecosystems are considered manageable. Caleb looked up at him. "By whose standards?" Vaylor answered confidently. "Galactic Biological Survey Division." Caleb nodded once. "Have any of them actually gone camping?" A few students laughed louder this time. Vaylor allowed himself a thin smile. "Field researchers have conducted extensive remote observations." "Remote," Caleb repeated. "That explains a lot." The professor folded his arms. "Would you care to elaborate?" Caleb glanced around the classroom, noticing every curious face staring back at him. He did not look annoyed. If anything, he looked slightly uncomfortable about becoming the center of attention. "Not really," he admitted. "I just think survival depends on knowing what is chasing you. On Earth, that answer changes every few miles." Ryan shook his head with a grin. "You humans really do think your planet is special." Caleb looked at him for a second, then quietly asked, "Compared to which species?" The room fell silent again. Professor Vaylor studied Caleb for several seconds before turning back toward the center of the room. He tapped a command into his wrist console, and every holographic predator vanished at once. A new display replaced them. It showed a clean anatomical comparison chart between humans and 12 of the most physically capable species in the Galactic Council. The numbers appeared one after another. Bite force, claw strength, sprint speed, night vision, natural armor, toxic resistance. Every category placed humanity near the bottom. Several students nodded as though the chart confirmed what they had always believed. Vaylor rested one hand on the podium. "Science does not concern itself with pride. It concerns itself with measurable facts. Humanity possesses very few natural advantages. Caleb glanced at the chart before quietly saying, "Depends on what you are measuring." Valor answered without missing a beat. "Very well. Please enlighten us." Caleb looked around the room. Nobody seemed hostile. Most of them simply looked curious. Even Ryan had stopped smiling. Caleb took a slow breath. "When I was 8 years old, my grandfather took me hiking in Montana." Ryan blinked. "Montana is a predator?" A few students laughed. Caleb smiled. "No, it is a state." Princess Mara leaned forward with genuine interest. "What happened?" Caleb shrugged. "Nothing dramatic. We walked about 6 miles through the mountains. I kept asking why he stopped every few minutes." "Why did he?" Mara asked. "Because he was listening." Valor folded his arms. "Listening for what?" "Everything." Caleb answered. "Wind direction. Birds going quiet. Branches breaking. Running water. Smells. Tracks in the dirt. My grandfather said nature tells you what is happening before you ever see it." The room remained silent. Caleb continued in the same calm voice. "He never told me I was the strongest thing in the forest. He told me to assume I was not." Valor nodded once. "A reasonable survival lesson." "It was." Caleb agreed. "But that was only the first lesson." "And the second?" Caleb looked directly at the professor. "Know which animal you are dealing with." Valor activated another series of images. Wolves, bears, mountain lions, large reptiles, birds of prey. Surely your educational system does not expect children to memorize every dangerous animal on your planet. Caleb chuckled softly. "Not everyone, just the ones that live nearby." Ryan frowned. "You teach children that?" "Pretty much." Caleb replied. "Some schools even teach basic wilderness safety. Parents do the rest." Several students exchanged uncertain glances. Princess Mara slowly lowered her tablet. "Your families teach predator identification?" "Among other things." Caleb answered. "Do not leave food outside. Do not surprise wildlife. Do not run unless you know what is chasing you. Stay aware. Stay together." Valor tapped another command. Earth rotated slowly above the classroom, covered with colored environmental zones. "According to council records," he said, "Earth remains one of the less hazardous inhabited member worlds." Caleb tilted his head slightly. "Compared to where?" Valor highlighted several officially designated death worlds filled with corrosive atmospheres and extreme gravity. "Compared to these." Caleb looked at the planets for a long moment before nodding politely. "Those places would probably kill us." "Exactly," Valor replied. Caleb smiled again. "Earth just tries every day instead of all at once." The room became strangely quiet. Nobody laughed this time. Even Ryan seemed unsure whether the human was joking. Princess Mara finally broke the silence. "Are you saying your people grow up expecting danger?" Caleb thought about the question before answering. "Not expecting it. Respecting it." Valor looked toward the Earth display again. "Council records describe humanity as highly adaptable." Caleb nodded. "That part is accurate." "Why?" Caleb looked at the blue planet turning slowly above them. "Because we never had the luxury of pretending we lived at the top of the food chain." Professor Valor remained silent for several moments, something his students had rarely witnessed. He looked at the rotating image of Earth, then back at Caleb, as though trying to reconcile the quiet young man in the last row with the picture he had built from decades of council research. Finally, he touched the control panel again. The comparison charts disappeared, replaced by a database window filled with official council ecological reports. "Perhaps," Valor said carefully, "our records require additional context." Caleb shrugged. "That happens." Valor enlarged the first report. Earth contains approximately 8.7 million estimated life forms. Classified risk level, moderate. Caleb smiled politely. "Keep reading." Valor continued. "Environmental conditions suitable for civilian settlement across most populated regions." Caleb nodded again. "Still true." Ryan folded his arms. "So your planet really is moderate." Caleb looked at him. For about 10 minutes. A few students laughed, but Caleb did not. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, worn photograph instead of another data tablet. It showed a younger Caleb standing beside an older man with a gray beard, both wearing hiking boots and heavy jackets. Behind them stretched endless pine trees beneath snow-covered mountains. Princess Mara tilted her head. "Your grandfather?" Caleb nodded. "Every summer." "Was he a scientist?" Caleb smiled. Electrician. Several students looked confused. Then why was he teaching wilderness survival? Mara asked. Because where he lived, Caleb answered. Every adult knew enough to stay alive outside. Vaylor looked up from the council records. Surely that knowledge belongs only to professionals. Caleb shook his head. Not where I grew up. Parents teach it. Grandparents teach it. Park rangers teach it. Hunters teach it. You do not need to be an expert. You just need enough common sense to come home. Vaylor seemed genuinely interested now. Describe your first lesson. Caleb leaned back, remembering. My grandfather handed me a sandwich before we started hiking. Ryan looked puzzled. That was the lesson? Caleb laughed. Not exactly. He told me never to leave food sitting around after lunch. Why? Because if something smells at first, you might have company you did not invite. Another student raised a hand. Did that actually happen? Caleb nodded. A raccoon stole my backpack once. The room relaxed with quiet laughter. Caleb continued before anyone could interrupt. A week later, we saw fresh bear tracks. Same trail. The laughter faded. Did you leave? Mara asked. We changed direction. Caleb answered. My grandfather said the mountain belonged to the bear long before we showed up. Vaylor slowly lowered his stylus onto the podium. Your people willingly enter habitats shared with dangerous wildlife. Millions of us do every year. Caleb replied. Camping, hiking, fishing, hunting. National parks are full during the summer. Several students exchanged surprised glances. One finally asked the question everyone seemed to be thinking. Why would anyone choose to do that? Caleb looked genuinely confused by the question. Because it is beautiful. Silence settled over the classroom again. Vaylor opened another council report. No record mentions this cultural behavior. Caleb gave a quiet chuckle. Council researchers usually visit cities. That is where civilizations are measured. Exactly, Caleb replied. You measured our buildings. He looked toward the giant image of Earth still floating over the classroom. You never measured the weekends. Even Professor Vaylor could not hide a small smile. For the first time that morning, he realized the council database had been describing humanity almost entirely through economics, diplomacy, and technology. It had almost nothing to say about ordinary families teaching children how to read animal tracks, respect changing weather, or recognize when the woods suddenly became too quiet. The omission seemed small at first. Then Vaylor looked back at Caleb and wondered how many other things the council believed it understood about humans simply because nobody had thought to ask the people who actually lived there. Professor Vaylor closed the council database with a slow swipe of his hand. The classroom lights brightened, and the holographic Earth dissolved into hundreds of glowing particles before disappearing completely. He looked around the room, studying the faces of his students. Most of them had stopped taking notes. They were watching Caleb instead. Very well, Vaylor said. Let us test assumptions instead of repeating them. Another holographic screen unfolded across the front of the lecture hall. A detailed topographical map appeared, showing forests, rivers, steep hills, and scattered rock formations. This is exercise 1, Vaylor explained. No predators have been identified yet. Your task is simple. Study the environment and determine where danger is most likely to appear. The students immediately leaned over their tablets. Colored markers began appearing across the digital landscape. Ryan confidently marked the darkest forest. Too much cover, he said. That is where I would hide. Another student selected the riverbank. Water sources attract hunters. Princess Mara quietly circled a narrow canyon. Limited escape routes, she explained. Vaylor nodded with approval after each answer. Then he looked toward the back row. Mr. Walker? Caleb studied the map for several seconds before asking, How old is this data? Vaylor blinked. Excuse me. The map. Caleb pointed toward the display. When was it scanned? Vaylor checked the file. Approximately 11 months ago. Caleb smiled faintly. Then I would not trust any of it. Confused murmurs spread through the room. Ryan frowned. It is a geological survey. Mountains do not move. No, Caleb agreed. But everything living on them does. Vaylor tilted his head. Explain. Caleb stood up for the first time that morning and walked toward the front of the classroom. He stopped a few feet from the projection and pointed toward the river. If there was a drought last month, animals might not be here anymore. Then he pointed toward the trees. If a wildfire came through, the cover changed. Next, he pointed toward the canyon. If prey moved somewhere else, predators probably followed. Princess Mara slowly lowered her stylus. You were saying the map is already outdated. Caleb nodded. Nature updates itself every day. Vaylor stared at the terrain for a moment before quietly asking, "So where would you begin?" Caleb answered without hesitation. "I would stop looking at where predators were. And instead, I would figure out where food is now." The room fell silent again. Caleb continued in the same calm tone. Predators follow opportunities. Opportunities change. Vaylor entered several environmental updates into the simulation. Rainfall, temperature shifts, seasonal migration. The map changed almost instantly. Rivers narrowed. Vegetation shifted. Animal movement patterns appeared as faint blue lines crossing the landscape. Several of the students watched their original answers become less convincing with every new layer of information. Ryan let out a slow breath. "My hiding place just became the busiest trail." "Exactly," Caleb said. "Static maps make people feel safe. Real places do not stay static." Princess Mara looked at Caleb with growing admiration. "Did your grandfather teach you all of this?" Caleb smiled. "Some of it." "Who taught him?" Caleb slipped his hands into the pockets of his hoodie. "Probably his father. And before that, someone else." Vaylor looked thoughtful. "Generational knowledge." "Pretty much," Caleb answered. "Nobody expects one person to figure everything out alone." The professor glanced once more at the constantly changing terrain before turning back to the class. "Council survival doctrine assumes stable environments." Caleb nodded politely. "Earth usually does not." Nobody laughed this time. Instead, dozens of students quietly erased their original notes and started over, no longer asking where a predator might be hiding, but asking the question Caleb had been asking from the beginning. What changed first? Professor Vaylor looked around the classroom before touching another control on the podium. The walls of the lecture hall shifted as hidden projectors activated. Within seconds, the room transformed into a full immersive simulation. The polished floor became uneven ground. Towering trees surrounded the class. Wind whispered through leaves overhead, and somewhere in the distance, water flowed across smooth stone. It was convincing enough that several students instinctively checked behind them. "This is a controlled exercise," Vaylor announced. "No actual danger exists. Your objective is simple. Spend 5 minutes observing your surroundings. Record everything that appears unusual." The countdown appeared above the class. 5 minutes. Nobody moved at first. Then the students spread out in different directions. Ryan immediately walked toward the tallest trees, studying broken branches. Princess Mara knelt near the stream, carefully examining footprints pressed into damp soil. Caleb stayed exactly where he was. He closed his eyes. Ryan looked back and laughed. "You are already giving up?" Caleb did not answer. He simply stood there, breathing slowly. Professor Vaylor watched him with obvious curiosity. Nearly a minute passed before Caleb finally opened his eyes again. He looked upward instead of forward. Then he smiled. "Interesting." Vaylor approached him. "What have you discovered?" Caleb pointed toward the treetops. "Nothing." The professor frowned. "Explain." Caleb spoke quietly, almost as if he did not want to interrupt the forest itself. "Exactly. Nothing." Several nearby students stopped what they were doing. "I do not understand," Mara admitted. Caleb gestured toward the branches high above them. "Listen." Everyone fell silent. Wind drifted through the leaves. Water continued flowing. Their own footsteps faded away. But there were no birds. No insects. No distant animal calls. Just empty silence. Caleb looked at the professor. "Forests are usually noisy." Vaylor listened more carefully. "Our simulation is functioning normally." "Maybe," Caleb replied. "But if I walked into woods back home and everything suddenly stopped making noise, I would immediately wonder why." Ryan crossed his arms. "Maybe there just are not any birds." Caleb smiled. "Maybe." Then he looked directly at him. "Would you bet your life on maybe?" Ryan had no answer. Vaylor quickly pulled up the simulation settings. Every programmed sound was active. Birds, small mammals, insects, amphibians. Everything should have been audible. He frowned and quietly entered a diagnostic command. The system returned a message. "Environmental suppression event detected. Wildlife response active." Vaylor stared at the display. "That is impossible." Caleb tilted his head. "What does it say?" The professor hesitated before reading the notification aloud. "Native wildlife has entered defensive silence due to the projected presence of a large, unknown organism." Several students exchanged uneasy glances. There is nothing here, one of them whispered. Valor zoomed out on the tactical map. A faint movement appeared almost 2 miles away, represented only by a slowly shifting thermal outline. The simulation had intentionally hidden its identity. Princess Mara looked from the display back to Caleb. You noticed before the system told us. Caleb shrugged. The forest noticed first. Valor slowly looked around the room. How many humans would recognize that silence? Caleb thought for a moment. Not everybody. Half. Depends where they grew up. You recognized it immediately. Caleb nodded. Because my grandfather never let me ignore quiet places. Valor looked back toward the simulation, then addressed the entire class. Revise your notes. Observation does not begin with what you see. Caleb finished the sentence almost automatically, as though he had heard it years before. It begins with what suddenly disappears. Nobody laughed. Nobody questioned him. Even Ryan quietly erased everything he had written during the exercise and started over from a completely different perspective. For the first time that morning, the class was no longer trying to memorize the professor's slides. They were trying to understand how one ordinary human student had learned to notice the absence of something everyone else had completely missed. Professor Valor dismissed the environmental simulation with a quiet command, but instead of restoring the classroom, the walls shifted again. The forest dissolved into a circular training arena surrounded by transparent observation panels. Above the class, a message appeared in bright white letters. Adaptive survival exercise. Live response simulation. This exercise is different, Valor explained. The environment will react to your decisions. There are no correct routes. There are only consequences. The students exchanged excited glances. This was the practical portion everyone had been waiting for. Princess Mara tightened the straps on her Academy field pack, while Ryan cracked his knuckles with obvious confidence. Caleb simply tossed his empty coffee cup into a nearby recycling unit and stretched his shoulders. You still look half asleep, Ryan said with a grin. Caleb smiled. I usually wake up halfway through the bad idea. A soft chime echoed through the arena. Dense fog rolled across the artificial landscape as the simulation generated another unfamiliar wilderness. Trees, rock formations, shallow streams, and tall grass appeared around the students with incredible detail. Somewhere beyond the mist came the faint sound of movement, impossible to identify. Valor spoke through the overhead system. Your assignment remains unchanged. Reach the extraction marker without drawing unnecessary attention. Work together if you believe cooperation improves your chances. The countdown began. 10 minutes. Several students immediately formed groups and hurried toward the most obvious trail. Ryan waved toward Caleb. Come on. Faster is better. Caleb looked down the path for only a second before shaking his head. You all go ahead. Why? Too easy. Ryan laughed. That is literally the designated route. Exactly. Ryan shrugged and disappeared into the fog with 5 other students. Princess Mara hesitated before following them. She glanced back once. Are you sure? Caleb nodded. I will catch up. She looked uncertain but continued after the group. Caleb remained alone for another few moments, scanning the ground instead of the horizon. He crouched beside the trail and brushed aside a layer of fallen leaves. Beneath them, the soil looked strangely compacted. He reached down, touched it with 2 fingers, then quietly stood again. Fresh traffic, he muttered to himself. Instead of following the marked path, he stepped into the thicker trees where no trail existed. High above the arena, Professor Valor watched every student's location on the tactical display. Most followed predictable movement patterns directly toward the extraction point. Only one blue marker steadily drifted away from everyone else. An assistant instructor looked concerned. The human is heading in the wrong direction. Valor folded his arms. Or he believes everyone else is. Inside the simulation, Caleb walked at an unhurried pace. He was not trying to move quickly. He was trying to move quietly. Every few steps he stopped, listening more than looking. The distant sounds shifted again. Branches flexed somewhere ahead. Then silence. Caleb smiled to himself. There you are. Meanwhile, Ryan's group had nearly reached the halfway point when the ground beneath the main trail suddenly lit up with flashing warning indicators. The simulation announced, primary route compromised. Recalculating safe passage. Students froze in confusion as new obstacles appeared across the trail. Princess Mara immediately remembered Caleb refusing to use it. He knew, she whispered. How could he know? Ryan asked. Mara looked back toward the forest where the human had disappeared alone. I do not think he knew. She watched the trees sway gently in the distance. I think he expected the obvious choice to become the dangerous one. Up in the observation booth, Professor Vaylor quietly replayed Caleb's movements from the last 5 minutes. The human had never rushed. He had never panicked. He had simply assumed that the easiest answer deserved the most suspicion. Vaylor looked at the tactical display one more time and realized something unsettling. Every lesson the council taught about survival began by trusting the environment. Caleb Walker's first instinct had been to question it. Princess Mara quickly gathered the remaining students away from the blocked trail, while warning indicators continued flashing across the forest floor. Nobody panicked, but the confidence that had filled the group only minutes earlier was gone. Every shortcut they had trusted now looked suspicious. Ryan stared at the glowing hazard markers before shaking his head. I cannot believe he saw this coming. Mara looked toward the dense trees where Caleb had disappeared. He did not predict this exact trap. Then how? Ryan asked. He expected the environment to change. Above the simulation floor, Professor Vaylor watched the tactical display update in real time. The primary route remained locked while the adaptive system quietly generated new variables based on the students' choices. It was functioning exactly as designed. The assistant instructor leaned closer to the console. The human is still moving. Vaylor nodded. Caleb's blue marker continued along an irregular path that ignored every suggested route. He was not moving toward the extraction point directly. Instead, he seemed to be circling around it. Increase environmental complexity, Vaylor ordered. Within classroom safety limits. The assistant hesitated. Are you certain? Yes. A soft tone echoed through the simulation. Wind shifted directions. Fog thickened. Fresh animal tracks appeared along the damp ground. Fallen branches blocked several narrow passages. The forest suddenly felt alive again. Caleb stopped walking. He crouched beside one set of tracks without touching them. A few seconds later he stood and quietly smiled. Too clean. He continued walking in the opposite direction. Back inside the observation room, Vaylor raised an eyebrow. Replay that. The assistant enlarged Caleb's viewpoint. The tracks looked perfectly realistic. What did he notice? The assistant asked. Vaylor remained silent. Caleb's voice finally came through the simulation recording. Real tracks never care if people can see them. The assistant looked confused. Vaylor understood immediately. The system placed them where students would notice them first. Down in the forest, Princess Mara's group reached another clearing. This time they stopped before moving. Nobody wanted to make another assumption. What do we do now? One student asked quietly. Ryan looked around before giving an answer nobody expected from him. We slowed down. Mara smiled slightly. That sounds familiar. Ryan laughed once. I hate admitting the human was right. Before anyone could continue, their communication devices chimed at the same moment. A message appeared. Environmental conditions updated. Previous safe zones no longer verified. Groans spread through the group. Again, one student muttered. Meanwhile, Caleb reached a small ridge overlooking the valley. Instead of searching for the extraction beacon, he sat down on a fallen log. He pulled a small compass from his backpack, checked the wind, and listened quietly. A minute later, another sound reached him. Not footsteps, not an alarm. Running water. He stood, nodded once, and headed toward it. High above, Professor Vaylor watched the movement with growing fascination. He is using permanent landmarks, he said softly. The assistant looked at the display. Everyone else is following the simulation. Exactly, Vaylor replied. He is following the world. A few minutes later, the tactical map displayed something remarkable. Caleb was now closer to the extraction point than every other student, despite taking the longest route. He had not rushed. He had not relied on system guidance. He had simply ignored everything that could change and trusted only what would still be there tomorrow. Princess Mara finally reached a small overlook and noticed a familiar gray hoodie waiting beside the extraction beacon. Caleb looked up from his seat on a weathered rock and gave the group an easy smile. Took the scenic route? Ryan asked, still breathing hard. Caleb shrugged. No, he pointed toward the constantly shifting navigation markers behind them. I just stopped letting the simulation decide where I should walk. When the final student reached the extraction beacon, the simulation dissolved around them. The trees faded into soft blue light. The wind disappeared. The stream became polished classroom flooring once again. One by one, the transparent observation walls turned clear, revealing the familiar lecture hall where the morning had begun. Nobody spoke. Even Ryan, who usually found something to joke about, simply dropped into his chair and stared at the empty space where the forest had been. Professor Vaylor remained at the front of the room without touching the control panel. He looked less like an instructor finishing a lecture and more like a researcher who had just discovered a flaw in decades of accepted theory. Finally, he broke the silence. Every student who followed the recommended path failed the first adaptation phase. He paused before continuing. Only one student questioned the exercise before the exercise questioned him. His eyes settled on Caleb. Why? Caleb looked slightly uncomfortable with everyone's attention. He rubbed the back of his neck before answering. Because where I grew up, the easy path usually meant everybody else could find it too. Vaylor nodded slowly. You distrusted the system. Caleb shook his head. Not exactly. Then what? I trusted that nature does not care what the map says. The professor stood quietly for another moment before walking toward the center of the classroom. He reached the podium, opened the lesson file, and then stopped. Instead of advancing to the final lecture slide, he erased the title completely. Students watched in silence as he typed a new sentence across the screen. Survival begins before the first decision. Vaylor stepped aside and looked at the words himself. For many years, he said, I believed survival was primarily a matter of responding correctly after danger appeared. He looked toward Caleb with genuine respect. Today I was reminded that true survival often begins much earlier. It begins with observation, with humility, with accepting that the world owes you no explanation. Princess Mara quietly closed her tablet. Professor, she asked, will the council update its curriculum? Vaylor smiled. It already has. He reached into the course settings and uploaded a revision request to the Central Academic Network. Under recommended reading, he added a new section, Human Environmental Thinking. Under required field studies, he added another line. Learn from local knowledge before you trust remote data. Ryan leaned toward Caleb with a grin that looked completely different from the one he had worn that morning. I owe you an apology. Caleb raised an eyebrow. For what? I thought your planet was ordinary. Caleb laughed softly. Most days it is. After today, Ryan said, I am not sure ordinary means what I thought it meant. Students began gathering their bags as the class ended, but nobody hurried for the door. Small conversations filled the room. They were no longer comparing predator statistics or memorizing escape procedures. They were talking about grandparents, hometowns, family traditions, camping trips, old lessons, and the quiet wisdom that never appeared in official databases. Princess Mara caught up with Caleb near the exit. Can I ask you one last question? Caleb nodded. Of course. What was the most important thing your grandfather ever taught you? Caleb looked through the tall academy windows where the afternoon sunlight stretched across the campus. He smiled in the same quiet way he had smiled when he remembered those summers in Montana. He told me that confidence is useful, Caleb said, but paying attention will get you home. Mara stood there for a second without answering. It sounded so simple that it almost felt disappointing. Then she realized why it mattered. The greatest lessons were usually the ones ordinary people repeated often enough that they became part of who they were. Caleb adjusted his backpack and walked down the hallway with the same easy pace he had carried all morning. He did not leave as the strongest student in the class. He left as the one who reminded everyone that wisdom is not measured by how loudly you speak, how advanced your technology becomes, or how many facts you can recite. Sometimes wisdom is simply learning to notice what everyone else walks past, and remembering that the people who survive the longest are often the ones who never stop listening.